It never starts the way people expect. It doesn't begin with intensity or obsession or chaos. It begins quietly, softly, with a feeling that finally something feels familiar. There is a sense of recognition that doesn't come from logic, but from the body. The empath feels seen without being asked to perform. The avoidant feels calm without knowing why. And neither of them realizes yet that this calm isn't neutral, it's charged, because what feels like peace at the beginning is actually the perfect psychological alignment of two nervous systems shaped by opposite wounds. One learned to survive by feeling everything. The other learned to survive by feeling as little as possible. When they meet, it doesn't feel like danger. It feels like relief. And that's why it hooks so deep. The empath doesn't attract avoidance because they are weak or naive or desperate. They attract avoidance because they radiate emotional permission. There's something in the empath's presence that says, you don't have to explain yourself here. That alone is intoxicating to someone who has spent their entire life needing distance to feel safe. Avoidants aren't drawn to chaos. They're drawn to environments where their nervous system can finally unclench. The empath offers that without realizing the cost. They listen without interrupting. They sense shifts without accusation. They feel tension before it's spoken. To an avoidant, this feels like space without loneliness. And that combination is rare. What makes this connection dangerous isn't the attraction, it's the imbalance that forms before either person is aware it's happening. The empath begins by giving what feels natural: attention, understanding, patience, emotional flexibility. None of it feels like sacrifice at first. It feels like love. Meanwhile, the avoidant begins to relax into that emotional cushioning. They talk more freely. They show up inconsistently, but are received warmly each time. They withdraw and return without confrontation. Their nervous system learns a powerful association: closeness without consequence. And once that association is formed, the bond deepens fast, even if the relationship itself never stabilizes. The empath often believes the connection is mutual because the emotional depth feels real, and it is real. Avoidants feel deeply, just not safely. So when they encounter someone who can hold emotional space without demanding emotional exposure, it creates a paradox. They feel close without being cornered. They feel understood without being examined. That's why the avoidant may open up suddenly, share something vulnerable, then disappear just as suddenly. It's not manipulation, it's nervous system overload. Intimacy activated something old and unprocessed, and the only regulation tool they know is distance. This is where the empath gets trapped, because distance doesn't feel neutral to them. It feels like something went wrong. Their instinct is to bridge, soothe, repair. They replay conversations. They soften their needs. They give the avoidant more room, believing that safety will eventually lead to consistency. But what they don't realize is that their adaptability is reinforcing the avoidance pattern. Each time the empath absorbs the rupture quietly, the avoidant learns they don't have to grow to stay connected. The relationship becomes emotionally one-sided without either person intending harm. The hidden psychology here is subtle but devastating. Empaths don't attract avoidance because they chase. They attract avoidance because they don't pressure. They don't demand clarity. They don't enforce emotional consequences. They feel deeply, but often privately. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant feels in control of closeness, while the empath feels responsible for maintaining harmony. Over time, the empath's nervous system becomes hyper-attuned, scanning for shifts, moods, disappearances. Meanwhile, the avoidant feels increasingly dependent on the empath's emotional regulation, even as they insist they don't need anyone. The connection intensifies, not because of consistency, but because of contrast. Warmth followed by absence, vulnerability followed by silence. The empath interprets this as something to stabilize. The avoidant experiences it as relief and panic in cycles, and in the middle of that cycle is the empath's empathy, endlessly trying to translate inconsistency into something understandable. They tell themselves the avoidant is just overwhelmed, just busy, just scared. And often that's true, but understanding someone's fear does not neutralize its impact on you. What makes this dynamic especially painful is that the empath often feels chosen. Avoidants don't open easily, so when they do, it feels significant. When they come back after distance, it feels meaningful. But what's actually happening is that the empath has become a safe emotional container, not a secure partner. The avoidant returns to regulate, not to commit. They leave to breathe, not to end things. And the empath stays emotionally available in between, holding space that isn't being reciprocated. This is the part no one talks about. Avoidants don't stay because they feel safe. They stay because they don't feel threatened. Empaths provide an environment where emotional needs can be accessed without accountability. There is care without expectation, presence without pressure, and unless the empath consciously interrupts this pattern, it can last for years. Not as a stable relationship, but as a loop. One person hoping consistency will arrive, the other hoping space will never be taken away. The tragedy is that neither person is wrong for how they adapted. The empath learned early that connection required attunement. The avoidant learned early that connection required distance. When they meet, it feels like balance, but it's not balance, it's compensation. One system overfunctions emotionally while the other underfunctions, and compensation always has a cost. Eventually, the empath begins to feel unseen, unchosen, emotionally tired. They may not ask for more, they just start to shrink. And the avoidant senses the shift, feels the loss of regulation, and either pulls closer temporarily or disappears entirely. This is why the bond feels so hard to break. It's not just emotional, it's physiological. The empath's body becomes used to waiting. The avoidance body becomes used to leaving. Both confuse the cycle for chemistry. But chemistry that destabilizes one nervous system to stabilize another is not love. It's a survival loop. If you're an empath watching this, understand this clearly. You didn't attract an avoidant because you were too much. You attracted them because you made emotional distance feel painless. You offered understanding before safety was mutual. You adapted before being met. And that's not a flaw, it's a pattern that can be interrupted. Awareness is the first fracture in the loop. And if you've ever wondered why this keeps happening, why the same dynamic repeats with different faces, it's because empathy without boundaries feels like home to someone who learned to survive by staying unneeded. The moment your empathy stops being unconditional, the dynamic changes. Not because you became cold, but because you stopped abandoning yourself to make someone else comfortable. This story doesn't end with blame. It ends with clarity. Because once you see the hidden psychology, you can no longer unsee it. And once you stop offering emotional safety at the expense of your own stability, the pull shifts. Avoidants don't lean into people who require mutual presence. They lean into people who make absence survivable. When absence stops being free, the pattern finally breaks. When absence stops being free, something shifts that most people don't expect. The empath doesn't suddenly become colder. They don't harden. They don't lose their depth. What changes is internal permission. Permission to feel the cost. Permission to stop smoothing over the ache. And that single shift is destabilizing for the avoidant in a way words never were. Because for the first time, the empath's presence is no longer guaranteed, and the avoidance nervous system can feel it immediately, not as fear of losing the person, but as fear of losing the regulation they quietly relied on. This is where the illusion breaks. The avoidant always believed they were independent, that they could come and go without impact. That closeness was optional. But once the empath stops emotionally hovering, the avoidant feels something unfamiliar, loyal gravity. Not pressure, not demand, just weight. The weight of realizing that someone was holding space they never acknowledged. And when that space isn't constantly open anymore, the avoidant experiences a subtle but unsettling panic. Not because they suddenly want commitment, but because their escape route no longer feels safe. Empaths often misinterpret this moment. They think now they care. And sometimes, yes, the avoidant does lean in more. They check in, they become warmer, they test closeness again. But what's actually happening is regulation seeking. The avoidant is trying to restore the emotional equilibrium they lost when the empath stopped overfunctioning. This is the most dangerous part of the cycle because it looks like progress. it feels like proof. And it can pull the empath right back into old patterns if they don't recognize it for what it is. Here's the truth that hurts to hear. Avoidants don't move toward consistency because they miss you emotionally. They move toward consistency when their nervous system feels destabilized. That's why the closeness often fades once balance is restored. The empath feels hopeful. The avoidant feels relieved. And the loop quietly resumes. This is not conscious manipulation. It's conditioned survival. The avoidant learned early that closeness equals loss of autonomy. So they approach it carefully, temporarily, and retreat once they feel safe again. The empath, meanwhile, is experiencing something entirely different. They're not seeking regulation. They're seeking reciprocity. They want to feel chosen, not tolerated. They want emotional presence that doesn't vanish once it's inconvenient. But because they've been trained to value understanding over self-protection, they often suppress this need. They tell themselves they're being patient, evolved, compassionate. What they don't realize is that patience without boundaries becomes self-erasure. This is why the dynamic drains the empath over time, not because they love too much, but because they love without being met. Their emotional system is constantly active, monitoring, adjusting, interpreting. They carry the emotional continuity of the nurse alone, and the body keeps score. Sleep changes, anxiety creeps in, joy dulls. They start questioning themselves instead of the pattern. They wonder if they're asking for too much, when in reality, they're asking for the bare minimum, emotional consistency. Avoidants sense this shift long before it's spoken. They feel the empath's energy change. Less availability, less immediate warmth, less emotional cushioning. And this is where many avoidants crash out, not outwardly, internally, because the empath's quiet withdrawal confronts them with something they've avoided their whole life, the impact they have on others, not in a blaming way, in a reflective way. The mirror they once found comforting now shows consequence. Some avoidants respond by pulling away completely. The moment emotional accountability enters the space, their nervous system reads danger. They rationalize the exit. They minimize the bond. They tell themselves it wasn't that deep. And on the surface, it looks like indifference. But internally, there's confusion. Because they lost something that didn't ask for too much, only presence. And that loss lingers longer than they expect. Others attempt to stay, but only halfway. They offer just enough connection to keep the empath from fully leaving while still protecting their distance. This creates an even more painful gray zone. The empath feels the tension, the inconsistency sharpens, the emotional push-pull intensifies, and eventually the empath reaches a breaking point. Not dramatic, not explosive, just exhausted. This is the moment of truth. The empath either abandons themselves again or they choose themselves for the first time. Choosing themselves doesn't mean closing their heart. It means closing the emotional loophole that allowed the avoidant to stay without showing up. It means no longer translating absence into understanding. It means allowing silence to mean exactly what it is, and that choice is felt instantly. When an empath truly steps out of the pattern, something irreversible happens. The avoidant can no longer access them in the same way. The empath's energy becomes self-contained, warm, but no longer porous. And this is when the avoidant faces a fork in the road. Grow or lose access. There is no third option anymore. Most avoidants don't choose growth, not because they don't care, but because growth requires sustained emotional presence. It requires staying when it's uncomfortable, and that's the skill they never learned. So they walk away, often quietly, often without closure. And the empath is left grieving, not just the person, but the version of the future they kept alive alone. But here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. Once an empath breaks this cycle, their entire relational landscape changes. They stop attracting avoidance at the same intensity, not because avoidants disappear, but because the empath no longer offers free emotional regulation. The magnet weakens. The dynamic can't lock in. And for the first time, the empath experiences connection that doesn't require self-abandonment. This is where healing begins, not by becoming less empathetic, but by becoming emotionally sovereign, by realizing that empathy is a gift, not an obligation, that understanding someone's wounds does not mean volunteering to bleed for them, and that love without consistency is not depth, it's depletion. If you're watching this and feeling seen, it's because you've lived this. You've been the calm in someone else's storm. You've been the place they rested without staying. And you've wondered why love always felt heavy instead of reciprocal. The answer isn't that you're broken. It's that your nervous system learned to equate connection with endurance. The cycle ends when endurance is no longer your measure of love, when presence becomes mutual or unavailable, when your empathy finally includes yourself. Because the moment you stop making absence comfortable, the dynamic either transforms or it collapses, and either outcome is freedom. This isn't about blaming, avoidance. It's about breaking unconscious contracts. Contracts that say, I'll hold everything so you don't have to. You were never meant to be someone's emotional home while living outside of your own. And the moment you step back into yourself, the hidden psychology loses its power. The pull fades, the confusion clears, and what's left is something quieter, steadier, and far more real than the chaos you once mistook for love. And once the chaos quiets, something unfamiliar settles in. Silence, but not the painful kind, the kind that isn't filled with waiting. The empath notices their body first, the nervous system that used to stay alert, braced for shifts, messages, disappearances, finally exhales. There's grief here, yes, but there's also relief, a strange calm that comes from no longer monitoring someone else's emotional availability. And that calm is unsettling at first, because for so long, tension felt like connection. This is where the deepest reprogramming begins. The empath realizes that intensity was never intimacy, that longing was never closeness, that effort was never love. They begin to see how often they confused emotional labor for emotional depth. And once that lens changes, the past relationships rearrange themselves in memory. What once felt like chemistry now looks like imbalance. What once felt like fate now looks like familiarity, painful familiarity. Avoidants rarely get to witness this part because when the empath truly detaches, it's quiet. There's no confrontation, no speech, no emotional performance, just absence with boundaries. And that absence hits differently, not as rejection, but as finality. The avoidant senses that something has closed that won't reopen with a casual return. And for someone whose safety depended on optional closeness, this is disorienting. This is where the hidden psychology turns inward for the avoidant. Without the empath's constant emotional buffering, they're left alone with their internal world. The feelings they kept at bay resurface, not dramatically, but persistently. There's a low-level unease they can't name, restlessness, a sense of something unfinished, and they may not consciously connect it to the empath, but their body does, because regulation doesn't disappear without consequence. Some avoidants respond by seeking another empath, someone new, someone warm, someone understanding, and at first, it feels like relief, familiar, safe. But the pattern repeats because the wound hasn't changed. The strategy has. Others shut down further, convincing themselves they're better alone, that closeness is overrated, that needing someone is weakness. But even that is a response, not resolution. The empath, meanwhile, begins to rebuild something they've neglected, self-trust. They start listening to discomfort instead of explaining it away. They stop overriding their intuition with compassion for someone else's fear. And this is where attraction changes. Not overnight, but subtly. They become less available to emotional ambiguity, less tolerant of inconsistency, less willing to romanticize potential over presence. This is the point where many empaths worry they're becoming too much or too guarded, but what's actually happening is calibration. They're no longer giving from an empty place. They're no longer bonding through endurance. They're allowing connection to earn access, not assume it. And this alone filters out avoidants who rely on emotional loopholes to stay comfortable. Avoidance can sense this shift instantly. It's not coldness, it's solidity. There's no chase available, no emotional elasticity to test. The empath is still kind, still deep, still warm, but no longer endlessly. And that combination is threatening to someone who equates closeness with loss of control. So the attraction weakens, or it never ignites in the first place. This is the quiet victory no one talks about. not winning someone back, not being chosen by the avoidant, but no longer being pulled into the same dynamic. The empath realizes that love doesn't require proving their worth through patience, that safety doesn't require self-silencing, that consistency is not something you earn by being understanding enough, it's something that exists or it doesn't. And here's the part that hits hardest. The empath didn't lose the avoidant. They lost the role they were playing, the role of emotional anchor, of silent stabilizer, of understanding without reciprocity. And when that role dissolves, so does the relationship, because it was built on imbalance, not mutual presence. Avoidants often sense this loss as emptiness rather than heartbreak, a vague awareness that something grounding is missing. They may think about the empath unexpectedly, not with longing, but with curiosity, wondering why that connection felt different, why it lingered, why it doesn't replicate easily. And that's because true emotional safety without enmeshment is rare, especially when you never learned how to create it yourself. The tragedy is that by the time avoidants recognize this, the empath has moved on internally, not to someone else necessarily, but back to themselves. And that return is irreversible, because once you experience connection without anxiety, chaos becomes controllable. Once you feel reciprocity, imbalance feels loud. Once you stop negotiating your needs internally, you can't go back to shrinking. This is where the story reframes itself. The empath realizes they were never attracting avoidance by accident. They were attracting them because they made emotional distance survivable, because they absorbed inconsistency quietly, because they translated absence into understanding. And when they stop doing that, the dynamic can no longer form. What replaces it is quieter, slower, steadier, and may even feel boring at first, because there's no guessing, no interpreting, no emotional spikes, just presence, reliability, follow through, and for a nervous system conditioned to intensity, this can feel unfamiliar, but it is peace. If you're listening to this and feeling a mixture of grief and relief, that's normal. You're mourning the version of love that required you to suffer to feel connected. You're releasing the belief that patience equals depth. You're letting go of the hope that if you just understood enough, someone would finally stay. This isn't a loss, it's a graduation. You were never meant to be someone's safe place while feeling unsafe yourself. You were never meant to carry the emotional continuity alone. And you were never meant to confuse empathy with endurance. The hidden psychology isn't that empaths attract avoidance because of fate or trauma alone. It's because empaths often delay choosing themselves, and the moment that choice is made, fully, quietly, internally, the entire pattern collapses. What comes next isn't louder love, it's truer love. And once you experience that, you'll never again mistake emotional absence for depth or chaos for connection. And when truer love begins to take shape, it doesn't announce itself loudly. There's no rush, no spike, no emotional vertigo. Instead, there's a strange, unfamiliar steadiness that almost feels empty at first. The empath notices they're no longer bracing for loss, no longer decoding silence, no longer rehearsing explanations for behavior that hurts. And that absence of emotional labor can feel confusing because for so long, effort was the proof that something mattered. This is the final withdrawal from the old pattern. The empath realizes that what they once called chemistry was actually their nervous system recognizing a familiar imbalance. Their body learned early that love meant tuning into someone else, anticipating shifts, staying one step ahead of disconnection. So when connection doesn't require that vigilance, the system needs time to recalibrate. Peace feels suspicious until it becomes normal. Avoidants rarely make it this far with an empath, because by the time the empath reaches this stage, access has changed, not dramatically, not defensively, but fundamentally, the emotional doors are no longer wide open by default. Presence is welcomed, absence is not chased. And that single shift removes the unspoken incentive that once held the dynamic together. This is when the avoidance internal testing stops working. Distance no longer pulls the empath closer. Silence no longer guarantees understanding. Inconsistency no longer earns patience. And without those responses, the avoidant loses their leverage, not over the empath, but over the dynamic itself. The relationship can no longer exist in ambiguity. It must evolve or end. And most avoidants faced with that clarity, choose exit. Not because they don't care, but because clarity feels like confinement to a nervous system. Wired for escape, emotional accountability feels like pressure, even when it's gentle. Mutual presence feels like exposure, even when it's safe. And the empath finally understands this on a body level, not as a justification, but as a limit. This understanding brings compassion without self-betrayal. The empath no longer needs to villainize the avoidant to move on. They see the wound clearly. They see how avoidance protected them once. And they also see that protection has a cost. A cost. The empath is no longer willing to pay. What replaces the old attraction pattern isn't indifference, it's discernment. The empath begins to notice subtle cues they once ignored. How someone responds to consistency, how they handle closeness over time, whether they stay emotionally present after vulnerability instead of disappearing. These things become non-negotiable. Not because the empath is rigid, but because they've learned what imbalance feels like in their body. And this is where the deepest healing locks in. The empath stops trying to be the emotional exception. They stop believing that love is proven through patience. They stop waiting to be chosen by someone who benefits from their availability without offering presence in return. They choose themselves quietly again and again until it becomes instinct. Avoidants who encounter this version of the empath feel it immediately. There's nothing to grip onto, no emotional slack to pull. No unspoken agreement that says you can leave and I'll stay the same. The empath's warmth is still there, but it's paired with boundaries that don't bend under pressure, and that combination changes everything. Some avoidants feel exposed by it, others feel uninterested. A few feel challenged in a way they've never experienced before. But regardless of their response, the outcome is the same. The old dynamic cannot attach, and that is the real transformation. The empath no longer wonders why they attract avoidance. They see it clearly now. They understand that they were once offering emotional safety without emotional requirements. They were creating space where distance had no consequence, and avoidance unconsciously were drawn to that freedom. The hidden psychology was never about destiny or trauma alone. It was about reinforcement. The empath reinforced avoidance by absorbing its impact. The avoidant reinforced empathy by returning just enough to keep the bond alive. Once that reinforcement ends, the psychology collapses. This is why healing feels lonely before it feels liberating. The empath isn't being pulled anymore, but they also aren't being distracted. There's space now. Space to feel their own needs without minimizing them. Space to notice what consistency feels like. Space to build connection that doesn't rely on anxiety to stay alive. And slowly, something shifts. Attraction becomes calmer. Relationships feel steadier. There's no urge to overgive to secure closeness. No temptation to explain away emotional absence. The empath realizes that real intimacy doesn't fluctuate wildly. It deepens quietly. If you've made it this far emotionally, it means you're no longer looking for someone to stay because you endured enough. You're looking for someone who stays because they choose presence naturally. And that standard changes everything. Avoidants don't disappear from the world, but they disappear from your life, not because you reject them, but because the dynamic no longer recognizes itself. You're no longer speaking the same emotional language. You're no longer available for half connection. And that is not love. That is alignment. This is the truth few people tell empaths. You were never meant to be the place someone hides from intimacy. You were meant to be met, to be chosen without disappearing acts, to be loved without translating pain into patience. And once you stop making emotional distance comfortable, the pattern ends permanently, not with anger, not with revenge, but with clarity. The hidden psychology is simple, and it's freeing. Empaths attract avoidance when empathy replaces boundaries. When empathy includes the self, the attraction dissolves. What remains is quieter, stronger, safer. And that's the kind of love that doesn't crash your nervous system. It steadies it. That's the kind of love you were always meant to have.